It is interesting to see that even though Sona is one of the oldest champions in League of Legends, she only just got a lore update that finally made her part of the modern lore. There are other champions in a similar position, but perhaps time will come for them too, at some point. Now there is no point prolonging this, so without further ado, let's have a look at the newly fleshed out lore of Sona. Sona comes from the Ionian monastery in the province of Galrin, which is located, obviously, in Ionia. There she was raised as an orphan. The local monks, along with kind-hearted volunteers from the local villages, took in anyone who was left at the front gates and properly took care of them. At first, everyone in the monastery just thought that Sona was shy and quiet, but then it became obvious that she couldn't speak at all. Still, she was unusually thoughtful and attentive, and the other children often came to her whenever they needed comfort, even though she wouldn't say much. And so, Sona discovered other ways to express herself. Unlike the other children, when Sona arrived at the monastery, she had one item with her: a curiously strung instrument, packed in a plain wooden case. None of the visiting musicians or teachers knew what this instrument was, though that did not stop several of them trying to get it for themselves, either by trying to buy it or steal it. But interestingly enough, since this was the only item which Sona owned, over time she taught herself how to play it, and her simple, beautiful melodies moved even the most skeptical listeners to tears of joy. However, sadly, it was around this time when Ionia was about to turn dark. The Noxian invasion began, and enemy troops started landing in the northern provinces. So preventatively, the monks evacuated their orphans to safety before the invasion reached Galrin. After this, the monks got a chance to make a deal with the Demacian trader, which was certainly a rare opportunity, because Demacia and Ionia are quite far from each other, and so not too many traders even bother to travel this far. Unless Runeterra is round and quite small, that way they could go the other way. Anyway, as a part of this deal, Sona and a handful of her friends found themselves bundled onto one of the last ships to escape, before the Noxians locked down Ionia's western coast. As Sona looked back in anguish, she knew she would not be able to return for many years, if at all. After months of traveling over the seas, they arrived in Demacia, which compared to Ionia, was a strange land where magic was widely distrusted. There, Sona learned that the Demacian monks were called Illuminators, and they worshipped no gods or spirits. Yet they still showed great kindness to all kinds of strangers in need. Still holding onto her special instrument, Sona was taken in by the Buvelle family. Because not only was Lord Barrett and his wife Lestara supporters of the Illuminator Order, but they were also the patrons of arts in the great city of Demacia. Over time, Sona became like a sister to their daughter, Kaina, and Lestara in particular grew very attached to her. As an interesting fact, Kaina is a name we have heard before, because she is the one who becomes radiant in the Order of the Illuminators when she grows up. And in fact, it is Kaina who befriends Lux and teaches her how to fight and defend herself. Anyway, the Demacian language was difficult to learn, but the Buvelle family developed their own sign language that enabled Sona to communicate easily with her new family and their friends. And yet, Sona wanted to express herself much more. So in order to show her appreciation to her adopted countrymen, she decided to use her gift to delight and soothe them. And so she returned to her music with renewed passion. Soon, word spread around the city of her great talents. Her performances captivated audiences, bringing them from sorrow to bliss, from righteous martial pride to almost exquisite peace. And Lestara became intrigued by the mysterious instrument that made this possible. Delving into the deep libraries of the Illuminators, she came to believe it was a fabled instrument called Etva, a wondrous artifact dating back thousands of years before Demacia's founding, which also meant it was extremely rare these days. If that were true, then this was an object of magic, and Sona's link to it was a dangerous gift indeed. Thankfully, Lestara was very kind-hearted, and so the next time she approached Sona, instead of taking her instrument away and trying to purge magic from her body with some cruel method, Lestara just asked Sona to keep it a secret, to avoid bringing unwanted attention from the Demacian mage seekers. Not really having any other option, Sona obeyed, though she wondered how something that brought people peace could be seen as a threat. Some years later, Lord Barrett Buvelle was slain fighting Noxus at the Gates of Mourning. When Kaina took up her father's blade and she joined the military, the heartbroken Lestara decided the time had come for Sona to return to Ionia. And so, the two would make the journey back together. In the aftermath of the invasion, the Ionians started a movement they simply called Restoration. But the locals were changed by what they had endured, and Sona realized there was no longer any place for her there. So, just as quickly as they arrived, which is a relative term since it takes months to sail here, saying farewell to Ionia once again, she went back to Demacia with Lestara. However, even though Ionia wasn't the best place to stay, her new chosen homeland had its own problems too, since right after she arrived back in Demacia, the story of Silas unfolded. And so, in the wake of King Jarvan III's assassination, the Mage Seekers have gained significant power, and many innocent citizens were being imprisoned for any supposed connection to magic. As a child of two wildly different cultures, Sona increasingly finds herself at odds with her family's political alignments. With Etwa in hand, her melodies now serve not only to provide comfort, but also to defend what she knows is right and just. And with these words, Sona's bio ends. Unfortunately, the bio doesn't really explain what Sona is fighting for, or who are her parents, but at least we can assume that she wants peace to return to the lands of Demacia, since after Silas's escape and the formation of the Mage Rebellion, the Demacian lands are anything but peaceful. Thankfully, to show us how much did Demacia change after the beginning of the Civil War, and to show us where Sona's lore is heading in the future, Riot also gave us a short color story that tells us what it was like to Sona when she arrived back in Demacia, and what will happen next. So without further ado, here's the story called One Last Show. The story begins with Sona standing in the courtyard of the Argentine Inn. She received a letter from Etra, who was Sona's childhood friend, and in that letter she asks Sona to meet her here. And just like that, moments later, Etra arrived, and she immediately ran to Sona to hug her with a shriek of joy. This made Sona sigh in relief, because ever since she returned to Demacia, everything felt different. But now she was glad to know that her friendship stayed the same. Of course, as the bio explained, everyone in the Buvelle family and all their close friends used their special sign language to communicate with Sona. And so, here as well, Etra used this language to ask Sona how was she. And Sona was happy she was finally able to talk back to someone. When Etra asked her how long will she stay, Sona replied as long as possible. After all, she would never refuse an empty stage. As their conversation continued, it is interesting to see how the story mentioned that as Sona used her sign language, she held her hands lower, because to random strangers, the language might have looked like she was trying to cast spells. The story then cuts to Sona standing in the middle of a barn that was converted into a stage. They called this quote-unquote concert hall in the Argentine area. At first there was no audience at all, but after Sona struck the first chord, a few familiar faces already approached her. Sona's Etwa was set in the middle of the stage, its golden front polished and gleaming. Normally the Etwa would be floating in the air, but now it's set on its little frame, which Sona brought only for Demacian performances. To Sona's right was a man called Cal. He kept the beat on some goat drums. To Sona's left was Etra, whose smooth voice joined Sona's melody after a while. As the three settled into the familiar rhythm, the crowd got a lot bigger. Some of the men even started singing along loudly. They were drunk faster than usual. Sona smirked at Etra, and Etra answered back with one hand, saying, "They missed you too." With the Mage Civil War ongoing, there was tension among the folk. Their king had died, and friends started fighting friends. So of course, these citizens were glad to enjoy some relief. However, as they kept playing, Sona noticed four hooded figures standing at the back of the audience. It was nothing out of the ordinary, until they pulled their hoods off, revealing their golden half masks. Sona's stomach turned when she realized they were Mage Seekers. And she even heard the slightest hitch in Etra's voice. But neither of them dared to look at each other right now. The only answer was to keep performing. The next song was a solo, and so Etra and Cal slipped into the backstage, leaving Sona alone. This was the moment the crowd really came here for. The song had no name, but everyone knew it regardless. It was Sona's own creation, and she relaxed into it. At first, the song was relatively simple. It flowed, built, faded, and built again. But then something evolved in the music. There was additional layers to it. Notes that seemed impossible were being played simultaneously. Sona looked up and she saw only smiles and closed eyes. In the air around her, Sona saw magical illusions that no one else could see. This flow came from the strings which stretched and snapped, as the air itself hummed. Then the Etwa had chosen someone, an older woman in the back of the crowd. And suddenly, the magic in the air, which only Sona saw, morphed to show what the woman was thinking of. It was her smiling husband, who passed a month ago. His wife would surely have a hard harvest without him. The Etwa then hummed something only to Sona. It was the last rasping song the man had ever sung to his wife. Without a pause, Sona weaved this melody into her performance. And when she looked up, she saw the old woman recognized it, and tears ran down her cheeks. As the music continued, eventually it reached crescendo, and it felt as if the entire crowd was enlightened. But then, a shout shattered the song, and Sona stopped, frozen. The mage seekers at the back had risen, and they started marching towards the stage. However, the audience was still transfixed by the song, and so they haven't even noticed them yet. Sona took 2 steps back, before the mage seekers shouted at her to stop. They were undeniably here for her. So Sona picked up her skirt and sprinted away. The Etwa just lifted up and floated after her, because at this point there was no reason to hide it anymore. Unfortunately, other mage seekers were already waiting for her in the backstage, and so she was trapped. She ended up with her back pressed against the wall, with 5 mage seekers slowly approaching her. In her head, she hoped Etra ran, because right after this, Sona used the Etwa and struck a violent burst of music. The cord shot forward and slammed into the mage seekers. The air turned gold, and when Sona heard their groans and their broken screams, she knew it was over. They were all dancing. Although it looked comical, as they were swinging around like puppets, Sona knew it was painful, but she also knew she had to make it painful, because pain would be the only thing they would remember. They would entirely forget Etra, so at least she would be safe. For a while, the mage seekers begged her to stop, but after a moment, they all went quiet, and there was only the sound of shuffling footsteps and the creaking and snapping of joints. Sona didn't want to hurt them, but they were the reason why her home wasn't home anymore. Then Sona struck one last chord. The air turned purple, and they all dropped to the ground. After that, Sona disappeared into the silence of the woods. And that is it for the complete lore of Sona. I'm not gonna lie, her ultimate is far more brutal than I thought. As you can see, even though Sona was eager to return to Demacia, after witnessing what happened in Ionia, she didn't remain in the capital city for long. And in fact, we are not sure what she is doing now. All we know is that Sona most likely didn't join the Mage Rebellion, because she has a quote against Silas mentioning that. But that puts Sona in a similar place to Lux, because at the end of her comic, Lux also left the capital, but she also refused to join Silas. So this to me is a hint that Sona and Lux may team up in the future. They would certainly make an interesting pair. One that doesn't talk at all, and one that talks too much.
Sona, I'm your biggest fan!